Like, how do we have scene, action, and name interplay? If you have a specific scene that's in your mind right now from the play to use with reference to this, awesome.
So it's very contextual, as the whole play is contextual based on the form that it's presented in. And the first one in particular, I guess, like, it's the big, exemplifies this the most in that.
Be specific here. Are we talking about Act 1 or Scene 1?
Yeah,
Act 1?
Part 1, Act 1, because they're portraits of forms more than portraits of characters. So it depends. So the VHS recording or the comic, traditionally, like in the form, we have names, right? The Squid and Clammy is the title of the scene because that's how comics are described. They just say the character's name, usually Charlie Brown, whatever. Peanut. Well, no, that's Peanuts. Marmaduke. But when it gets down to like programming code as a form, that's scene 8. We just use letters. So it's reduced or expanded based on where it takes place, the name.
So different sort of spaces or institutions have different kinds of names. Coding will have mere letters, whereas if you're taking a tragedy class, you have ancient Greek, so you have the whole history and etymology of the Greek language, perhaps, if you're talking about, but also we're talking about forms, portraits of forms, and form itself is like the name for the type of names. Is that, or how would you, like, what's the relationship between name and form versus the whatever else, how we usually think of name, which is Jessica Prusa, Rachel Stuart.
Right, like the form precedes the content. I mean, not even necessarily, but I'm like pushing that out as like, at least it's as important as the content in Act 1. So let's make everything in relation to the form, or the form is the umbrella, the driver that's influence. What is that word? That is informing the rest of the decisions.
Yes. Why is it good to make, this sounds to me like making conspicuous the form where it's usually just content that we put our flashlight floodlights on. Yes. Look at the content, look at the content.
Yes.
Why are you floodlighting forms? What's at stake in floodlighting forms?
I think, well, a lot of things. In particular, and probably like most importantly in my mind, our generation has experienced like a huge amount of formal changes in communication and rapid changes, which to me feels very disorientating. And this is my way of like mapping how I've absorbed information, and I can't separate that from the way it was presented from me. And the form, as it's increasingly disembodied, like, I know that has an effect on me, and so it starts with a VHS recording and ends with a talk show. But the talk show subject that's being interviewed on Kathy Lee, Good Morning America, whatever, is from 2018, right? She's very contemporary, and she's clashing by wearing like metal, and like she has chains in between her legs and like in between her arms here, and that's like her performative costume that they critique and don't really understand. So it's like, after absorbing all of this, this is how I am, and this is the form I'm taking in the world, and it doesn't fit this formal thing that was around during the VHS recording time.
Okay, two things are popping to me as questions. One is it's sort of just it's asking after your feeling about the reality of contemporary forms. Is there the differentiation among them, or is there a common thread where, even though it's like letters through CSS coding and say talk show host, TV, or whatever, all the different institutions or spaces, places with their forms, is there a common? Do we have a lot of variety, or are we finding that they're actually flat? Or, but then the corollary question, it feels a little loaded to ask both of them, but I just want to put things on the table for you to play with. It's what is there something distinct about how a poet relates to forms, like their orientation to the forms or the relationship to form and content, that would be distinct from just common everyday? And is like the poet a model that might be imitated by others with respect to forms they're getting from when, say, I'm watching Judge Judy, or I'm looking at my Facebook scroll, or I'm thinking about when I'm filling out the birth certificate for my daughter when in the hospital, and I'm naming my daughter, I'm circling female or male, even time, what time were you born? Was it a C-section? Like all these ways that we don't even think about. These are forms we fill out, bureaucracy. Like is there a common thing between them right now that makes them, we got to get conscious, they're conspicuous this way, there's this thing in common which is problematic in our forms? And yes or no, or is there variety, and if so, where? And is there a certain variety that has more or less promise? And then what's a poet's role in that orientation, and is it to be imitated by just anybody or everybody? So that's kind of just the whole thing.
Yeah, I think
like what can a play do? Your play is like making conspicuous forms with respect to those questions. What's a play do showing?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of this has to do with the incorporation of light, and this is expansive, meaning bigger than a book for me, because a book is an object, so it's disembodied first and foremost, and we are we need to put things in a form that they're given to us or for me, I need to do this to fully understand them. And so the use of lighting in the first act, for example, is like a chronologic relation, in that it starts out very dim to signify like the fuzziness and blurriness of a VHS recording, and by the end of the talk show, which happens outside, we have daylight and electric light coming from the floor, so it's an overexposure of right now. And they're like live characters, right? It's a live talk show. Whereas the second part, which is a documentary, it oscillates between like light and dark, and progressively overexposed and progressively dark, with like floodlights highlighting this particular moment or essence or something. And I think this is poetry for, I'm using light like words as a poet. And this is part of the language, the huge part of the language of the play, and why I couldn't do that in a book.
This is a little tangential, but do you think it might be that just what the name or the form book has come to mean, it's not possible in a book, but perhaps that understanding or present form of book is one that's limited, and that might be in need of rethinking? That's just probably, of course. Like, is there promise yet in the book?
I think,
or what's the difference between a play and a book, or where might they entwine?
What Cecilia Vicuña was saying in her video on poetics, of that, like the book is disembodied, and it's more in a institutional or academic form. Like, this is the focus during a reading or performance or something that someone creates. The central focus is the book, right? I'm reading from the book, and everyone can have it and read along or whatever. And she was saying, like, in her performances, where does the camera go? And there's no way to know, because it's improvised. So that means the camera person has to be way less passive and engaged in the process, as everyone in the entire space does. It's not a passive activity. And I think this is timely right now, because all of our passivity is collapsing on ourselves in relation to, who our president is right now. So the more we can get people interacting and engaged with form and content, we can like spread this awareness of our own emotional resonance of how these forms are affecting us. What does it mean that I have to like look around with my eyes in order to understand something instead of just like sitting still and having it come to me? How can it be like a participation or a collaboration? How can the audience affect what happens on stage?
Yes, it's very interesting. Just checking. Good. Yes. There's something of the question of what do form. It's a lot of things. What do different forms entail, engender, permit, encourage, discourage, remember, forget. If any of those things strike you right now where you might want to talk about them with that language, like the permit thing is about a form is like law, it's a boundary. And to transgress that boundary, it's like, are there penalties associated with it or not? I tend to think of poets or writers as people who just perpetually transgress them to see and then return with like the prodigal son. I transgressed and now I return with here's the crop from that transgression. Audience, do with that what you will. But the theme throughout being no passivity.
Yeah.
Engage. A play would make present for an audience to, well, yeah, you just did that prodigal son, but what happens when I do that, and do I go through that? The next place I would want to jump with that, but then I'm sort of skipping over a question, is something like, what's the affective state of someone who is doing that with forms and boundaries and transgressing them or rubbing up against them? Pleasure, pain, easy, hard. You were leaning into something of the political, social possibilities of this, of like what participatory. This is like a social thing, to participate with another. How one is with others is the question of politics. That is what is politics. So this leads us into how are we together? What is community and how it constitutes? So insofar as this is about looking at boundaries, going past or negotiating them, and that has an affective state of its sense of a feeling pleasure and pain. What's that feel like? Tell me about the feelings of this and how one's handling that. And in your audience, like, do they want it? Do they want this? Do they have to be convinced of this? Are they repelled? What's motivating the affective states? Is there a consciousness of that in the writing? Is there something plays do versus, say, an essay or a BuzzFeed article? You know what I mean, right? You know, what's going on there?
I feel like just personally, it's made my own cage more tactile and understandable. And so I can't separate, you know, like who controls the media? 4 people. And how do those forms that they put, you know, advertising or whatever in, like, how much space do we have to move within that? Because they're in equal control of the expression of it, right? And I can't click a slideshow now. I can't see all the slides, for example, in some websites. I now have to individually like go to different pages, and so I could see like 10 more ads instead of just one ad that I would see if it was all laid out on the page. So it's like all of these have been pointing to the restrictions and compromises one makes when you're engaging in whatever forms, and that's informed the way, like, you know, I'm navigating content and what I'm choosing. And this is kind of the whole project brought to light of why I'm doing the things that I'm doing unconsciously. This is a conscious clarification for myself. Like, why do I hate the internet in a lot of ways? Like, and where is it okay for me to be on the internet that's not terrible? And increasingly, that's becoming a smaller and smaller space with the media in general, because we have no more control over it. meaning it's no longer a participation that we all have like free reign over. It's just really in the hands of very few people, you know, shoving themselves into my interactions that I wouldn't like. So I don't think there's like, you know, I want the audience to feel this when they see it. I'm merely presenting, this is how I view how I'm seeing all the different cages that I'm in by creating them and using bodies. And like, what does an email, crowdsourced email look like? You know, like in the play, it's like a stoplight you have a person in a frame, there's 3 sections of the frame, the head is red, the body is yellow, and the green is the call to action. What are you meant to be doing by the end of this email? What's my intent? But then when it gets taken over from the personal to the sponsorship, or like the public now, instead of like the sender being lit up in red, like as a flashlight, the sponsor is like painted red. It's already, he is that.
It's overdetermined.
Yes.
There isn't a otherwise possible. There's no multiplicity of possible conclusions.
Yes.
And it's interesting, we begin with coming with, so forms are like a law or a boundary. The internet is very interesting because on an apparent level it looks like boundaryless, infinite. There's no walls in the internet. It goes on, and you could never ever in a whole like the whole thing of you take my data, but how are you sorting it? And what means do you have for sorting it such that my Fourth Amendment privacy? Not that I'm not frightened by all of this, because I think we might invent algorithms to really become pernicious, but is the internet limitless? Is its limit its limitlessness, actually, paradoxically, and limitlessness, its apparent absence of limit is its limit. Without a limit, without a boundary, it stays flat. How do you even bite into it? If the apple was bigger than your head, or if you couldn't even if the arc of that side of the fruit or what you're eating was bigger than the arc your mouth could make, something like, then it's just like, oh, there's just this big apple, you know, like, but you couldn't use your body to go into it. That's just a response. But the thing that's interesting to me about what you just said, okay, so I asked after an affective state, and I didn't hear, oh, it's pleasure or pain, or I'm trying to make my audience uncomfortable or be overjoyed or more reflective or anything like this. It's, is it, whatever forms you give them, it sounds to me like you are gesturing at lighting. It's more or less alive, which would be plurality of possible responses.
Right.
And to get a plurality of possible responses, it has to be a form. There has to be a boundary, that it's only with limitation and constraint and in a particularity of some kind that seemingly non-intuitively, many things are possible.
Right.
Because I can enter. There's a whole. It's the incompleteness as well as, and its incompleteness is, it drew its walls around here and it said this in, that out.
Yeah.
Incomplete. Is there anything you want to say about incompleteness, holes, porousness, the aliveness of something as opposed to a particular affective, good, bad, pain, pleasure, that are binary opposites that seem to just get us circling and going nowhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me a cage is, or like the first image that comes to mind is a metal structure that's you can see in and out of, you can reach in and out of. It has exits and entrances that are small, and it's not easy to do. Like, I don't think the door is open, right? But on all sides there are entrance points, and I think by like developing a framework of the frame, we can then see how to navigate it better. Like, okay, I can fit like 2 fingers in this hole and like a leg in the other one. And I think in relation to like the apple as a metaphor and the internet being like expansive that you can't bite it with your mouth, I think the oppression, I don't like that word, but like the control, just like TV, like when TV started sucking because it's too corporatized and we're making candy and not content, that is like a degradation or like a deterioration of the apple. Like it's getting moldy from this side and like now I don't even want to bite it. So but that's reality, right? So all of these things are just like reality of different kinds of cages. And I think, I mean, personally and well, whatever, acknowledging and making something conscious and bring something allows you to navigate it.
That is one, I wrote down, with that you just gave it, it's a phenomenology of the cage. And you're putting the tools, what I hear is that it puts the tools in people's hands to give an account of their own cages, phenomenology of their own cages. That's just experience.
Yeah.
That's just like, hey, I'm asking you to tell me about the experience of your own cage, and not in a way where it is just mere prison, but there's entry or exit at every point. There's a Egon Schiele painting that's like a prison door, or it's like a door with a window, and it's like a barred, actually the top of the window, and you see the light go in and out, but it's so liminal, like where's this door even to? It's an incomplete room. The room is like almost imagined, but with the perspective on the page, it's like, yes, this is a room or a cage, but I love it because the walls aren't drawn. I project the walls onto there based on the absence that's left in the perspective of the door with the window with the bars on it.
Right.
It's really, like your description of Kate made me go there immediately.
Right.
And
because it's half associative. It's half on you to fill in the gaps.